First, we got to talk about the war on immigrants being waged in this country, the strategic white supremacy of the Republican Party and the Trump administration. There's a couple of things to be really clear about here. Yes, there is undoubtedly a broader context and history behind these actions. Going back, in fact, arguably, if we're going to focus in the last 30 years of politics, to a 1996 bill signed by Bill Clinton, written and pushed through by the Gingrich far-right Congress, expediting people being deported from the country then, including people seeking refugee status in contravention of the 1951 status on refugees and not penalizing people seeking refuge. The growth and proliferation of detention centers was already a global phenomenon well before even the Obama administration. And of course, we know that President Obama accelerated deportations and presided over very vicious policies with regards to immigration as well. However, this is different, and it is an acceleration. And we need to recognize this, not only because we need to recognize the basic objective reality we're dealing with and not draw false equivalencies, but also because we have an opportunity to potentially address three things through the distinct, dangerous inhumanity of the moment as exemplified by the forced ripping apart of parents and children at the border by the Trump administration with the support of any relevant figure in the Republican Party. And that is, number one, recognizing that this further development of an overtly white supremacist strategy is both at once entirely keeping with American history in a way that goes back, of course, to literally the founding of this republic on genocide and slavery, but also one that is a distinct acceleration in terms of its nakedness in the modern era and coming right on the heels of the distinct historical accomplishment of the first black president, and one that fits a global pattern of far-right populism, which can always be synchronized with capitalism. Two, the center is done. And we can keep dunking on the center, fighting the neoliberals, and we will. We'll have to. But that political project is utterly exhausted. It still has relevancy because of money, incumbency, and cultural influence, but it is speaking to no one. It's a constituency of elites with no aliveness in real politics. Yascha Mounk, who is a Harvard lecturer and a director at the Blair Institute, Tony Blair is renewing the center think tank in the UK, has a new book focusing on the dangers of populism across the globe. And funnily enough, he actually does an okay job of diagnosing right-wing populism. He also, in contrast to the sort of brands he's associated with, has some basically pretty moderate social democratic answers to how to address the problem in some areas, including dealing with inequality to some extent, investing in education, infrastructure, and other areas as well. And as one reviewer in the LA Review of Books pointed out, some of these answers make a lot of sense, and none of them will ever be administrated without a left-wing populist politics that claws back democracy from a global oligarchy. We already know that at the end of the day, in a conflict between a socialist-oriented politics and a far-right populist politics, capital will choose that far-right populist politics because ultimately, as we see with Trump, there isn't any fundamental contradiction between giving corporate America absolutely every single thing it wants and practicing overt xenophobia, racism, and bigotry. Number three, Achille Mbembe in 2016, the Cameroonian philosopher, suggested that Gaza was a map for how the developed world would deal with colonial subjects globally as we headed into a world of ever-decreasing resources, stricter controls on movements, and insurgent neo-reactionary forces. He wrote, in the United States, the killing of black people at the hands of police will proceed unabated, and hundreds of thousands will join those already housed in the prison industrial complex that came on the heels of plantation, slavery, and Jim Crow laws. Europe will continue its slow descent into liberal authoritarianism, or what theorist Stuart Hall called authoritarian populism. Despite complex agreements reached at international forums, the ecological destruction of the earth will continue. The war on terror will increasingly morph into a war of extermination between various forms of nihilism. Inequalities will keep growing worldwide, but far from fueling a renewed cycle of class struggles, social conflicts will increasingly take the form of racism, ultranationalism, sexism, ethnic and religious rivalries, xenophobias, homophobia, and other deadly passions. The denigration of virtues such as care, compassion, and kindness will go hand in hand with the belief, especially among the poor, is that winning is all that matters, and who wins by any means necessary is ultimately right. And how else could you draw any other conclusion from how we've designed our global system? That was the structural reality. This is the truth of the fact that the neoliberal and right-wing consensus was laying the groundwork. This piece was published before Trump was elected. That was seeded and guided by particularly the policies of the last 30 to 40 years. That being said, it would be wrong to draw an equivalency and not see the acceleration we are in right now. An acceleration that has an attorney general, as we'll watch in just a moment, who has to talk on national television about why his policies are not Nazi-like by, of course, totally distorting the historical record of Nazi Germany as well. Here's Jeff Sessions with Laura Ingraham from last night.
Nazi Germany, concentration camps, human rights violations. Laura Bush has weighed in, Michelle Obama, Rosalind Carter, got all the first ladies going back to Eleanor Roosevelt. She's apparently weighed in as well. General Sessions, what's going on here?
Well, it's a real exaggeration. Of course, in Nazi Germany, they were keeping the Jews from leaving the country. But this is a serious matter. We need to think it through, be rational and thoughtful about it. We want to allow asylum for people who qualify for it, but people who want economic migration for their personal financial benefit and what they think is their family's benefit is not a basis for a claim of asylum.
So there you have it. He's dismissing, of course, people fleeing bone-crushing poverty, other basic humanitarian concerns, often particularly if we're talking about Latin America, policies that are directly or indirectly created by United States foreign policy in the region. We have to be clear about three things. There's a history and a context behind the moment we're in, which is, if we take it back to the foundations, runs through American history and runs through far-right populism across continental Europe. In the modern era, there's no doubt that the neoliberal consensus of globalization, the dislocation of communities, the far-right oligarchs fueling religious passions, bigotry, xenophobia of their bases across the globe also has fed to this moment. And that we are facing new and uncharted territories for the modern time, and you cannot draw a false equivalency. This is something new. And that number three, to the liberals out there, we are the only game in town for actually protecting the values that you claim to cherish. If you want even the bit of restored normalcy, you need to follow a radical path. You need to uproot norms if you want to restore any norms. So we're going to actually open this up just briefly. We were debating this in the office earlier. It was a really good conversation. It will continue in the postgame, but really just of how to balance recognizing the history and the context of these policies, which implicate politicians across the board and both parties, obviously, but without drawing false equivalencies. And I just wanted both Matt and David to just chime in on this and kind of, get your thoughts on sort of handling this balance and these policies as well.
Yeah, I mean, so regarding the legacy of, for example, like democratic power over the state apparatus. And what that means for today is like basically the question is like how do we talk about Obama? How do we talk about who's previously been?
I would
in
add
power?
Clinton
And Clinton,
as well.
without a doubt.
Yeah.
I would just say, just to open it up and to start with, one thing that I've been sort of harping on is that under Obama, we saw a huge expansion of the powers and the infrastructure of ICE, and it was used to terrorize families. It wasn't used in the same way, and it wasn't used as cruelly, and it wasn't used as egregiously. I mean, what's going on right now is an absolute horror show, and to compare the two things is wrong, and it's not going to be successful at getting our message out. But I would say what's very frustrating for me is you realize under the Trump administration how quickly that they've been able to implement this policy. I mean, it's like a wave of the finger kind of thing. And that's because they had these fascists and these monsters on the border ready to implement this kind of thing under Obama, right? And I think that it's a failure on our part if we aren't clear about this, because the worst thing that can happen is if Trump goes away and we don't address the structural conditions that allow this kind of depravity to continue.
And this is also why, and as distinct, I mean, I have trouble with some of the false equivalencies and point scoring that people do at times, but you're 100% right. And that's also why, when Kamala Harris says today she won't disband ICE, that's a problem, a major problem.
Yeah, I think I fall somewhere in between this, and I think the argument is sort of where we want to put the stresses. But my thing is like I'm fairly comfortable having a conversation where the people I'm talking to all sort of basically agree that America's a fascist state, sort of par excellence.
Certainly, with regards to our racial history, that's undebatable. It's not remotely debatable.
But I do cringe when it's the Obama did this card, because I do think that oversimplifies and overpersonalizes it. When I think decoupling going into the long lineage of this shit is better than just saying but Obama did this thing, because I think that is so focused on liberals, right? And scoring points on liberals, which when we were talking about this earlier, David says like those are the people you can win over. So I do think there's a balance here, but I also think it seems so occupied with people who aren't really. They're kind of peripheral at this point.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that the thing that disturbs me on the line you're talking about is that there is a certain type, like the people that want to pretend that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are still in power are the fascists that are running the country, and a handful of people whose only response ever to anything, whether it be this just grotesque, abominable, everybody who's been involved in it should be imprisoned behavior with regards to immigrants. But going through, criticizing accelerated civilian casualties across the world, which have spiked under Trump. Again, not in any way exculpatory. That's another area where Obama's massive expansion and codification of Bush's massive expansion of the national security state has been, the keys were handed to Trump, of course. But the neurotic tendency to rush to every new horror always has to be put in juxtaposition with something that, quote unquote, Obama did is both not the kind of rigorous long-term history which implicates everybody like you're talking about, and starts to look like a very weird, very specialized form of concern trolling, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my response to that would just be this, and I don't think that we're necessarily... I think you and I have a bit of a tension, but it's not as wide as you might imagine.
Right.
Which is that, for me, when I criticize American capitalism, for example, borders are incredibly violent structure.
Innately.
And we don't disagree on that, obviously.
Of course.
But when we talk about these kind of structures that create the conditions that we're seeing explode right now, we're talking about of people whose worldview includes that. So while Republicans enjoy that, like that kind of worldview because they do want to enact violence against immigrants from Latin and South America, liberals believe in a kind of structure that is a rules-based, norms-based structure where you have to punish the wrongdoers. You have to punish people
Right.
for breaking the law, and there is not as wide of a
That
gap.
disgusting Tim Kaine quote
Yes.
that you brought to mind
Yeah,
earlier.
and, you know, Tim Kaine, for example, was talking about how he doesn't think we should open. Literally,
This
talking
was
about
several years ago.
Yeah, this was
but he
several years
states-
ago.
yeah.
But in Virginia, there was a bunch of undocumented people in Virginia, and he was complaining about the fact that City Hall had opened up their doors to get these people all the calls. Literally, a complaint about them opening the door, and it's like, so there isn't as wide of a gap as what I'm saying between a kind of worldview that is like predominant within liberals, as liberalism defined as like a philosophy, rather than people who might vote Democrat over Republican.
Well, and also I would just suggest too that liberalism also defined as a failed electoral tactic set within a playing field that is defined by the right. Because anybody who and this again, this is very frustrating, the last thing I'll say. Obama's abominable policies at the border, I think you're right. I actually think you're right. There is a punitive tendency in that, and there is a thread that maybe we'll get to later with an immigration attorney who had a very disturbing exchange with Obama several years ago with regards to some of the policies that anticipated these separations, and that's real. Although, and then there's another part which is not justifiable, but is just so foolish to not see the foundational difference in. So when Obama triangulated, which is what he was doing, third way Clinton playbook, deport a bunch of people, amp up the border, and then eventually does DACA, which again, like, I'm a material deliveries guy. That's a night and day difference in millions of people's lives. And then he was doing it morally, strategically, in every way wrongly. We should have been on the streets then. He's doing it to set up getting a deal because that's the Democratic playbook. A ineffective and immoral way of getting a deal is a fundamentally different proposition than white America torture refugees. And if you can't not only see, and by the way, if you wanted to say Bush, Obama, and Clinton were two sides of the same coin, and even inside those coins, there's still real material differences in people's lives, that's an arguable case. Bush did want that reform. This ain't that. This is a policy set that is reducing legal immigration, shithole countries, why not more people from Norway, and a party that has decided 100% that the fusion of oligarchy and white identity politics is how they win. That is, within the last couple of decades, not a new thing, but it's a codification of a tendency in a way that people have not seen before, even under really obscene administrations. And that's and we got to be real about that.
Well, I mean, 100%. I definitely understand what you're saying. I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot of tendency to focus so much on Obama on the left,
and that's another.
Yeah.
I'm keep jumping in. I think that's also. It is not effective to our broad. Why? Just think of it optically. Why so many people want to focus on the sins of the first black president when he's followed by an overtly white supremacist-based president is not. It's not strategic. Not to say that we don't have to hold and be serious. Conversely, people, they want Obama to come back and he's the second coming and all this. That's nonsense. But that needs to be, that's a dialectic that needs to be balanced.
There's a way, I think, to criticize Obama that sort of doesn't fall into that trap.
There is.
And I think that a lot of people miss it. I mean, I think a lot of people on the left, and I'm going to look at, you know, so you're judging people harshly, and I don't disagree necessarily with your characterization, but just for balance, that you'd be a liberal.
You want balance? That sounds like a liberal pussy shit to me.
You know, I feel like a lot of people, like very serious, like immigration activists, were campaigning so hard for 8 years.
Yep.
And this was supposed to be a moment where, you know, things were really supposed to radically be changing. And I think a lot of people are very frustrated that they weren't. And they still have a kind of, you know, animus that they're still holding on to on some level that makes people lose sight of like a strategic value of a critique which I do think is right. And I think that one thing that's sort of frustrating, looking at knowing what Trump is and knowing what Trump was, for example, you look at DACA.
Yep.
And keeping those registrations and not doing something about protecting the identity of those people when we knew who was coming into office.
No doubt.
When we knew about this exceptional moment of this fascist administration, when we knew that Jeff Sessions was going to come in and run and be the Attorney General of the United States, I think not protecting the people who had registered and opening them up to the kind of abuse that we're seeing from the from ICE and from the Department of Justice.
I agree
think
100%.
that that's a shame, and I think that people are rightfully upset.
And moving forward, let's add this to the litmus test. Look, if you're running as a Democrat, Medicare for all, abolish ICE, I mean, I don't want to hear from you otherwise.
I mean, the way I look at this is America policy for the last, I don't know, however you want to put it, like half century is basically what you'd expect from liberals cooperating with fascists to the exclusion of the left.
Right.
But that also doesn't give you license to lose track of the distinctions between liberals and fascists.
Last thought, if I may, I just think that it's important that we try to make a different. We can stand with liberals against the right, and we can try to push liberals as much as we want and stand with them right now to stop what's going on right now, because what's going on right now is absolutely horrifying. But I think that it's really important that we make sure that we can stand distinctly on our own, and we say that we're not interested in making any of these kind of concessions.
And we're not, and we never will. And that's why, maybe we skip it now. Maybe this will be an unintentional benefit. Maybe, maybe the left gradually takes charge. But look, if Hillary Clinton was president, we'd be fighting her every single day. And there would not be the same level of just raw human suffering. And we wouldn't be having to get back to basic baselines of fights. But I agree with you completely. We have totally different politics. And as I say, if you're motivated by a certain type of liberal concern set, you better get serious about socialism, because you're not going to be able to restore what you want through your failed methods and accommodation of people who will destroy you.